Welcome to everyone who's joining us today. I'm Kenny Taylor with the Center for Nonprofits and Philanthropy here at the Bush School at Texas A&M University. We appreciate you joining us today to listen in on a brief presentation regarding racial leadership equity at nonprofit organizations. Just real quick, I'll talk just a bit about our center here. We were founded or launched in 2017. That's when I had the opportunity to join the university here. Our mission is to support a vibrant nonprofit sector, or the sector here in the state and of course beyond. And what we focus on are high quality research, professional outreach with opportunities like this, and our engaged learning opportunities that we provide every day for our graduate students here at the school. The educational opportunities that we have include our Master of Public Service and Administration degree, again, which is a graduate degree, our Executive Master of Public Service and Administration. We also offer a graduate certificate in nonprofit management. Those are our graduate level credit courses. And just last year, so this is our second year of our certificate programs, which are non-credit professional education courses and certificates focused on nonprofit leadership and also in social justice leadership. When we think about the social justice landscape, or if we just think about nonprofits compared to corporations, generally speaking, I think that at least in my mind, we go to the for-profit sector kind of being ahead of the nonprofit industry in terms of investments that they're able to make into their operations, how they work in the communities that they do, how they treat their customers. So as I've thought about social justice in the nonprofit landscape, I've thought about just a few industries that I thought were worth mentioning today. And one, of course, is or at least for me anyways, is the grocery industry. And if we look at some of the things that they've engaged in lately, if we think about where we grew up, the communities that we come from, and the grocery stores that appeal to the people that live directly in those communities, they seem to have been ahead of the curve in terms of how they think about where they specifically operate. And of course, being all over the place, prioritizing their customer base is extremely important. And lately we see that they have significantly invested in this issue of social justice across the United States. When I look at their diversity statements, what they seem to focus on anyways is having a theme of commitment to properly serving their employees, their customers, and the communities in which they operate. So we take a quick glance, we'll see that Albertsons has invested approximately $5 million to social justice organizations. HEB right here in the state of Texas, $1 million to address and fight racial inequities. Joe Lasco, I'm from Chicago, so anyone that's joining us maybe from the Midwest today is familiar with them. They invested $1 million for grants focused on Black and Latinx small business owners and marginalized communities throughout the city. Kroger, $5 million to improve social diversity, equity and inclusion. And then Publix, I think they operate out of Florida, where they invested $1 million to the National Urban League affiliates for their ongoing support of civil rights efforts. Another industry that I've thought about for a long time, this goes back to some of the partnerships that I've been familiar with as a nonprofit professional for many years. And the banking industry seem to always be on top of how they think about the clients that they serve in the communities, and ensuring that when I walk through a door in my local neighborhood, when I was living in Chicago in the inner city in Louisville, Kentucky, that I was greeted by people that look like me. And so when you investigate some of their diversity and inclusion statements, one that rings and that we work with happens to be with Bank of America. The way that they put it, they think about in thought, style, sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, culture, ethnicity, which also can be viewed as race and experience, that they recognize that their diversity makes them stronger as a company. McKinsey and Company, this is interesting. They're a financial services corporation. They have done some studies in the area about what diversity means for them. And they believe that, and they've, per some of the studies that they've engaged in, has to do with them having executive team and boards, that they believe that there's a correlation there with higher profitability. And so they say in a couple of studies that they produced from 2015, 2018, and I think here recently, that's remained consistent, that for every 10% more racially and ethnically diverse that they are as a company or their senior team is, they see earnings before interest and taxes nearly 1% higher. So they've been a believer in this for a while as well too. The other would be Beneficial State Foundation, which is a banking service in California, I believe. They're a financial institution who effectively increases their diversity and creates safe and exclusive and inclusive work environments that they'll be better equipped to serve their customers, especially in low-income neighborhoods and marginalized communities, because their employees and frontline staff reflect and represent the communities that they serve. So I think the theme here, and the reason why I have the better equipped to serve their customers, with frontline staff who interact with folks in the communities that they serve, is important to them, and also something that we've seen in the nonprofit sector as well too. So just to build on that a bit, when we then go to and looking at nonprofit research that's been available and consistent for a while, we have learned that board member diversity and expertise are associated with better performing organizations, with the caveat that it creates creativity or promotes creativity and innovation. We've seen that less diverse boards have more difficult time responding to the varied needs of populations that they serve. Let me go back just real quick. Making the need for diversity an important aspect of director recruitment. So the last one that I'll recognize is that diversity is an essential part of making effective decisions and delivering appropriate services to minority clients. And that's a study from 2014, not too long ago. Kind of back to the business sector, or what we've learned from corporate America. These are a couple of articles from the Harvard Business Review. One, getting serious about diversity enough already with the business case. Of course, when we've talked diversity, or as corporate America has looked at diversity, the first thing they started with was, what's the business case for diversity? As reference, where some of them believe that it correlates with higher profits. And then the other being why so many organizations stay white, understanding how race is historically and structurally built into the workplace. So with the first one, they pointed out in that article that increasing diversity by itself does not increase effectiveness. And so what matters is how an organization harnesses diversity and whether it's willing to reshape its power structure. Again, things that we are starting to see in the nonprofit management literature as well. And then with the other article, they point out that the simplest way to think about organizational whiteness is through statistics. So what do the numbers say? And then thinking must go beyond the numbers. It's the reason why these numbers persist and matter. And that's what I think I've hung in on a bit. And I think that is commonly shared these days when we think about research in the nonprofit space of, what do we know about ourselves from a different demographic standpoint with regard to leadership within nonprofit organizations. And so the board source, they produce a report. They produced the last one in 2017, the most recent one in 2021. This is the Leading with Intent report. I'm just guessing that many of you all are familiar with this stuff, but just to go back through it, that in 2017, we saw that 90% of all executive directors and CEOs identified as white. So 90%, all board chairs in 2017, 90% identified as white. All board members, generally speaking, 84%. We've seen a bit more diversity come into play, I think, in the last couple of years since 2019. So having conducted this same report in 2021, we see that those that identify as white, the executive directors and CEOs at 87%. Board chairs is where we've seen, I think, the most movement to the tune of 6%, where 83% versus 90 identify as white in 2021. And then all board members at 78% versus 84% 4 years ago. So, why is this important to me? I think I have some folks who are joining us today from Louisville, Kentucky, where my career didn't start in the nonprofit sector, but basically as a college student, that was my first real job in the sector at Big Brothers Big Sisters over in Louisville. And at the time, again, just to speak to why this is interesting to me, having dedicated my entire life to public service work in the form of youth development. And when I started, over 25 years ago now, at Big Brothers Big Sisters over in Louisville, Kentucky, I didn't think about being the only Black person there. I didn't think about being the only male there at the time. But what I did think about was the responsibility I had at the time was to go out, work with children, work with families, and then walk back into my organization and not see anyone who really truly looked like the population of clients that we served. And so that was a weird feeling as a Black male who was going out working with at the time, kind of dedicated my life to service, wanting to help kids that looked like me, maybe grew up like I did without a father, and then walk back into an organization that supposedly, not to say that they weren't, but supposedly was making the best decisions that we could as an organization on behalf of the client base that we served at the time. And so this is something that we think persists in the industry. At the time, I never really thought about it as something that would last 30 years, but it's well documented now that tends to be the same case that we operated in. If we just think about the numbers that I just shared with you, if we look at the power structures within nonprofit organization, again, when I think power structure, I think decision makers, those being the executive directors and CEOs of organizations, still is pretty homogeneous even to this day. And so part of what we're trying to work on or advocate for is how do we get better in that space. And so just in having this particular slide up, without identifying whose research it is, these are the reasons that have been identified in research over the years as to why homogeneity persists within the industry from a variety of nonprofit scholars throughout the United States. So, when we think about, what is the call to action, what we have seen, at least again, identified in much of the research that's out there now on diversity, equity, and inclusion, is that over the last few years, especially, there's this high awareness of DEI programs, and everyone should be doing it. And do nonprofit organizations have a responsibility to address these issues before anyone, based on the public good that we're supposed to be providing out there in the world? But also what research has really come to a conclusion on is that more awareness has been raised versus there having been any real movement in terms of who occupies leadership roles and decision-making roles at our organization. Again, kind of going back to the numbers that I shared with you. So what we started to think about here at the school is, how could we not just be part of raising awareness that this is something that has been identified for a long time, simply contributing to raising awareness, and how could we move more to action. So what are we going to do? What's our responsibility in terms of supporting the vibrancy of the sector, understanding that we have a long way to go, and understanding that we are in position to advocate, actually work in the space, and do something about what's our contribution to diversity, equity, addressing inequities at nonprofit organizations. We see that just as well as we see developing leaders in the fund development space, developing leaders in the marketing space with regard to nonprofit organizations, that social justice is a part of that. And just to be clear, when we say social justice, this is simply advocacy for more people, an array of leaders, races, ethnicities, cultures, to be engaged in the decision-making process at our organizations at a level that we believe will ultimately better serve our clients if we can get to a place where we're more diverse in our organization. So the call to action, more than anything today, is really to move beyond the efforts that have increased awareness of justice issues within the sector, but again, that have not necessarily led to widespread change within the sector. So, when we think about, so you're here today, again, we appreciate you being here today, but I guess the next few points are, so Kenny, what do we do about this? And we see this really kind of as, two ways to address some of these things, or for those of you all joining us today, what can we do about it? And so the way that I wanted to set that up today is to think about it from a leadership intervention standpoint, and what can be done at the individual level as leaders. And then, of course, what can we do from an organizational level? I didn't mention much about my background. I know that we have several friends that are joining us today. Some of you all know some about my background. But basically, my research is in the leadership theory area, leadership studies, and my work was focused on identifying behaviors of nonprofit leaders, and if in any way does that lead to job satisfaction of employees. And so with that, I've spent a lot of time kind of thinking about leadership within nonprofit organizations. Where do leaders come from? Who are they? What are their behaviors? What type of leaders do we need for future leadership at nonprofit organizations? And so as we've been focusing in this space a bit, what naturally kind of came up is leadership is extremely important to this process of social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as much of the leadership theory or the leadership studies literature identifies, is that we really have to start with ourselves. So who's in the decision-making roles? How do we look at ourselves as leaders? What commitment do we have to developing as leaders? And when we know as young leaders in the field that we want to continue to develop, what are those things that we need to work on, kind of generally speaking? So when we talk about conducting a leadership intervention, something that we do all the time anyways, I'm sure many of you all have invested in leadership assessments, that you go through trainings. We have some of you all who have joined us for many of the fee-based opportunities that we have. So you invest in all that stuff. I guess one question is, how can we invest in ourselves along the lines of getting better, making a contribution to the equity space within nonprofit organizations as well too. So on an individual level, just like we have identified in the leadership space, is to really start with reflecting and identifying who you are as a leader, whether that be your styles, your attributes, your behaviors, and connect racial equity leadership development, or your development that you aspire towards, to your core values. And so there's several different theories when we think about leadership. that we can utilize, or several different processes that we can use when we think about leadership. And this one really speaks to being authentic. So one of the primary constructs of being a authentic leader is really connecting with your, or identifying your core values. So who you are as a person, and then thinking about from there, how can you utilize that to become the best leader that you can. So if any of you all have been through a process where you've identified your core values, or you're currently in the space of identifying your values, that without even talking about the racial equity space in itself, is really trying an authentic approach, understanding who you are, understanding your values along the lines of how you can best utilize those in the leadership roles that you hold or that you aspire towards. Another leadership theory that we talk about, or I'll talk about two of them, but the other theories that we can think about are transactional leadership and also transformational leadership. And I'll go through some of the transformational leadership stuff first, just in terms of identifying basically what it is, and then how we potentially can utilize it for or thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so transactional leaders, it's a behavioral approach where leaders do not individualize the needs of subordinates, nor focus on their personal development. And that includes the constructs of contingent reward and management by exception, both active and passive. So first, I'll talk about contingent reward. That is where leaders, or describes leaders anyways, who attempt to obtain agreement from employees on what needs to be done and what the payoff will be for those who do it. And so an example here might be, and I'm only pointing these out just as examples for folks to potentially identify with. What is your leadership approach? You know, how do you carry out leadership? And so these are just examples for what we know is out there, at least from an academic or scholarly level anyways, is that this might be a supervisor who negotiates with an employee that if he or she attends a DEI training, that will be taken into consideration for promotion. So we'll move on to the next one and talk about management by exception active. This more describes leaders who typically engage in corrective criticism, negative feedback, and negative reinforcement. And so here, leaders set standards and punish employees when associated goals are not met. This might look like, at least in the diversity space, where there's daily tight-knit monitoring of how DEI initiatives are implemented. And this might also look like a leader who quickly corrects employees who do not carry out equity initiatives in the manner prescribed at your organization. And then when we think about management by exception passive, this also describes leaders that typically engage and corrective criticism. But here, this is when leaders don't set any standards, but take action with employees only after problems arise. And this is also known as passive avoidance. So this might look like leaders who give employees an unsatisfactory performance evaluation with regard to DEI goals without ever discussing his or her prior performance. Another leadership approach that goes with, or that is considered, at least in the leadership literature anyways, above transactional leadership is transformational. And this is an approach where leaders are obligated and have a duty to show concern, lead by example, and being knowledgeable with an energetic approach to developing others. And the four constructs there are individualized consideration, intellectual stimulation, idealized influence, and inspirational motivation. Here with individualized consideration, this describes leaders who provide a supportive climate. They listen carefully to the individual needs of followers and how that or what that might look like just in terms of the DEI space or carrying out those initiatives at your organizations is where you would be a leader that understands the experiences of those that work for you and deepens trust regarding equity. And then also what you might do as a leader is identify personalized training specific to DEI skills of employees based on your individual knowledge of the folks that you work with. Intellectual stimulation, this describes leaders that stimulate followers to be creative and innovative and challenge their own beliefs and values as well as those of the leader of the organization. And so here you're encouraging followers to challenge the status quo and to achieve higher levels of performance. Problem solving around workplace structural inequities might be something that you see here, an approach that folks can use. Idealized influence, that describes leaders who act as strong role models for followers. Followers identify with these leaders and want very much to emulate them. So the leader of the organization, the leaders at an organization embody the qualities that he or she wants to see in their team members. And the way that you might see this play out is your personal display of the highest regards to morals and ethics within your workplace. And then lastly, inspirational motivation. This describes the leaders who communicate high expectations to followers, inspiring them through motivation to become committed to and a part of the shared vision of the organization. So here, leaders inspire members around being able to accomplish more together than they would in their own self-interest around trying to carry out equity initiatives. And so what that might look like around your organization, I'm sure we've all seen this, is where there's an understanding by leaders that not everyone will buy in to some of these new initiatives, and that the leaders know that they're responsible for enhancing the level of team spirit, if you will, at organizations around these types of initiatives to drown out naysayers, if you will. One of the things that I'll just stay there for a quick second, but one of the things that came up, I alluded to it, I think, and one of the comments that I made is if we look at the leadership literature, transformational leadership is typically viewed as above transactional leadership. And so one of the questions that, that came to me had to do with, is transactional leadership what we need with regard to equity issues? Because we haven't come very far in terms of diversifying leadership roles at nonprofit organizations. So is there a carrot that we hang out there to have more movement? And some view transformational leadership as pretty aspirational, of the leader that can communicate well, and sometimes may seem broad in their approach versus, even though they may be great at setting a vision at an organization, as I'm sure we're all aware of, is that sometimes those broadly communicated messages related to vision don't get quite specific enough. And so one of the things in thinking about the leadership approaches that we could use to addressing justice issues, diversity, equity issues within the nonprofit space is, what leadership approach not necessarily is best, but what works well, what potentially works well for the advances that we need to make. And it's not just being authentic and utilizing your core values to drive who you are as a leader. It's not just transformational leadership. It's not just transactional leadership. There's other leadership approaches that we can utilize. It might include being a good situational leader and understanding from a development standpoint where your employees are and what you do at a given time, whether an employee be new to your organization or whether your employees have good long tenure at your organizations. How do you treat them depending on where they're at professionally with regard to the missions that you serve and their understanding of your operation. So there's a variety of leadership perspectives, approaches out there that any of us can look like. But I think when we try to address, racial equity and racial leadership specifically within nonprofit organizations, that we're going to have to attempt to put something in play in terms of our own leadership to help move this along a bit. There's literature out there related to diversity, equity, and inclusion that simply says or concludes that there's no way to be considered a good leader if you aren't thinking about your own cultural competencies and what are those that you possess, what are those that you need to build, and if you aren't focused on building those cultural competencies in today's world with regard to both operating, whether it be in a corporate environment or nonprofit environment, that it's hard to classify ourselves as good leaders. So what are those competencies that we need to be familiar with? How can we utilize a transformational approach? How can we utilize an authentic approach, again, to help move this particular issue further down the road? And so when we think about leadership interventions from an organizational standpoint, what I've reviewed and what seems to be fairly consistent in terms of structural things at organizations that have led to this day where we have a history of 30 years of nonprofit organization decision makers remaining fairly homogeneous. Many research studies have concluded that this all has to do with structural issues at nonprofit organizations that have simply remained in place and that we haven't addressed at a level to where we truly investigate what those things are. And so in the limited amount of work that I've done in this space or that I've focused on, I want to make sure that I communicate to anyone who's joining us today is that I'm not a diversity scholar. I'm not a justice scholar. I'm a practitioner who worked in the nonprofit field for 25 years, more than 25 years, who's reflected on this. And now as an academic has the opportunity to focus on this a bit based on my lived experience within the nonprofit world. And so we could say in the last couple of years, as I've really focused in on this area, many research studies, or there's been some consistency anyways, that we come right back to these structural issues. So if we think about this from an organizational level and what type of intervention that we could do or conduct at our organizations, I really think it comes right down to what policies do we have in place at our organizations? And those policies might have to do with fairness in hiring practices. Equitable pay has been long identified as a reason that employees leave, particularly employees of color within the nonprofit sector. Why they leave or don't stay or move on to greener pastures, I think is how it's been identified in many research studies. So pay has always remained a big issue one way or the other, and certainly with regard when we think about equity within the nonprofit space. Racial equity in itself, what policies do we have at organizations? I think we've all seen, again, just to make sure that I'm clear, I worked in the industry for nearly 20 years directly with nonprofit organizations. Again, I think I mentioned having worked for Big Brothers Big Sisters for 12 years. I started as a social worker, so literally on the ground with kids and families and volunteers, all the way up to the CEO of my own agency over in Austin, Texas. And so when I think about how do we address racial equity, and I go back and think about the inclusion statements that we had at our organization, I think what it really broke down to is we had some very simple boilerplate information about our non-discriminatory practices at our organization. But I think that there might be the opportunity there to get a bit more specific in terms of how we think about racial equity with regard to our policies. So a general look at your organization as to what do your policies say, and if you have something that is a blanket, we don't discriminate based on race, blah, 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 there may be the opportunity there to go a little bit deeper. And then what defined procedures do we have for holding bad actors accountable for improper treatment of color? And you know, like I said, you know, along the way, you know, this is something that, yeah, you know, I've personally experienced myself. The one that I often reflect on, you know, had to do with, you know, pay in terms of some of my peers that were running a certain size organization, serving a certain number of kids. So pay was one of those that I, you know, personally experienced that, you know, was kind of always on my shoulder, or something that was in my head that I thought about just in terms of the job that I thought I was doing at my organization with regard to peers that I had in the field, that maybe there was some, you know, fairness there, fairness issues there. So from an organizational level, what can we do? The literature says, I believe, that when we think structural in our organizations, policies, if you have someone or the type of leader, or if you are the type of leader that once you get your policies straight, that you're willing to enforce the stuff that's in there. And I think what we've seen is pretty common practice. That's the reason why I mentioned the, you know, what are the procedures for holding people accountable when we experience, or when people of color experience improper treatment. But we can see that not only in that area, you know, we talk about bad board members that don't show up. You know, who's the person responsible for holding folks accountable for showing up? So this is something that can be added one way or the other, and it just breaks down to leaders making sure that it's there, and then also being the one to address those situations as they arise. One of the things that we were able to do with our certificate in social justice, we pose some organizational equity assessment questions to folks that are participating in that program, the certificate that I mentioned to you a little earlier. So also from an organizational assessment, I mean, this is pretty simple. If you look at or Google equity assessments, there's a few out there, and they're fairly consistent in terms of the types of questions that they're asking. But take your organization through an equity assessment. And again, some of the questions, I'm paraphrasing, but again, these seem pretty consistent at the ones that I've looked at, is if you don't have policies, or if you go to your organization and you look at your policies and you see that your policies don't necessarily reflect or address equity issues, look at your strategic plan. You know, what's in there with regard to racial equity or DEI goals? Are they addressed per the other programmatic areas that you have outlined in your strategic plan? Are they addressed with the operational areas that you've addressed within your strategic plan, whether it be fundraising or marketing, your programmatic goals, things like that? Just spoke on this one a minute ago, but are there definitive actions and consequences for when people of color experience discrimination, whether it be direct, indirect, inadvertent, or intentional? What happens at organizations when something like that goes down? And I think we've heard from several people that nothing happens. I don't know how to address it. I'm uncomfortable addressing it. Well, the person that experiences that, if they raise that and nothing happens, just think about the position that that puts those folks in. Does your organization have any performance goals related to developing people of color for leadership role? That's something that's really stood out in the literature as well, that people of color need more training, or we want to develop people up so that they're ready for those opportunities, you know, when they present themselves. Well, if you don't have a mentor if you're not prioritizing, developing a population of folks that we know don't currently occupy those spaces, what are we saying to, again, people of color that want to give their life or thrive to work, aspire to work or stay within the public service space? Do executive directors and CEOs, boards address racial inequities within their formal organization updates? Is this something that's talked about at board meetings? Is it something that's communicated to the community that they serve in, to their external stakeholders? Is it a normal conversation like fundraising is a normal conversation? Is it a normal conversation about what's going on from an equity standpoint, just like it is for how many people you want to serve a year? The other, if you want to go deeper, I think would have to do, does your mission and vision statement kind of reflect an organizational commitment to racial equity? I think the implication for this is when we just kind of think down the road, specifically related to the nonprofit sector, what's the implication? I think the biggest one is that just not being able to fully realize, its potential or our potential as public servants and nonprofit organizations. Generally speaking, when we think about how demographics are shifting in the United States, when we think about nonprofit organizations already tend to serve in communities of color, but we have nothing going on in terms of who's in those or who occupies leadership roles within. What's the implication? We think about it one way or the other. Can we realize our full potential as organizations in our own communities in terms of the true number of people that need to be served in our community, so that we can claim that we did or that we do a good job in terms of the services that we provide? So again, I think the justice space takes it, just simply to one more level, where we know organizations already struggle with financing their operations. We know organizations already struggle with serving the amount of clients that they serve. We know that, or we feel like if we can't get a more diverse array of leaders within decision-making roles, will we truly be impacting not just the amount of people that we serve, but in the quality way that we feel like we can do so in terms of making best decisions in the communities that we operate in. So with that, before we take any questions, is just to remember what's at stake when we think about racial equity within nonprofit organizations. And so even if we weren't talking racial equity, the way that I'm quite sure that most nonprofit leaders, decision makers within the industry think about our work is, can we deepen, can we advance our mission at our organizations one way or the other? And just to keep in mind that research has been pretty consistent in saying that, the more racially, culturally diverse we are, that there's some creativity there, there's some innovation there that we could potentially take advantage of to push our missions down the road. The individual level, again, just kind of mentioned to you already that as we think about ourselves as leaders, we get to work with graduate students every day that we're preparing to go out in the field of public service. And when we think about our own professional development, what's our next step as a leader? If we want to get better at Excel, or if we want to get better at simply working with people and developing others, if we want to get better with our communication, if we want to get better at fundraising, one of the things that I believe cannot be left out is how we think about diversity and equity, and making sure that we try to get a broader array of leaders in decision-making roles, especially within nonprofit organizations. I think there's an argument out there that, should nonprofits lead the way in this versus relying on corporate America to lead the way on it, just because of the type of work that we are into in terms of service and of making the world a better place. And then allow
We lose you, Kenny? Nope. Yeah. Give him a minute here. Let's see if he comes back.
Will, that's just Kenny deep in thought.
Is that what that is? Ron, I saw you deep in thought as well.
Yes, sir. Very much so. Very much so.
I think we lost him real quick.
I think we lost him.
Ron's always deep in thought.
My hero.
If y'all knew what I was deep in thought about, you wouldn't say that.
Will, while we're waiting for Kenny, this is Angela. I'm sure he's trying to get right back on to finish up with you guys, but I thought something that's kind of interesting from one of the research studies I did was that one of our challenges, as he talked about executive directors and board members and diversity, was when I surveyed a group of organizations, everyone said diversity was important. Yet when we asked different questions, what was revealed was that they didn't see the direct link between having a diverse board and their organization's effectiveness.
Right.
So, that's something that goes a little deeper into how leadership communicates their messaging around it. And where Kenny said, are we talking about this on a regular basis with the board? That might be one message that could start the conversation. Looks like Kenny's back named Nicole now.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened, but my computer started acting weird, so I just walked across the hall. But thank you all. I'm back in action if any questions, or to keep chatting a bit.
Well, Angela just posed that one. I don't know how much of that she caught, which was sort of, people say it's important, but the practices that are put in place don't always necessarily align with the perceived priority. Sorry, Angela, that was part of it. I was kind of watching what Kenny was doing as well.
Sure. Yeah, Kenny, I was just filling in until you got back. There was some of my research that showed that disconnect where board members and EDs both said diversity is important for our organization. Yet when we asked different questions, one of the big challenges was they said, well, diversity is not important to the effectiveness of our organization.
Okay.
And I think being able, when you said, are we having regular conversations about diversity at our board meetings? I think that seems like a nice question to start with, as opposed to counting people sitting around the table, or, have we filled our new board slots? But instead to have a generative conversation about why diversity matters for our organization, how it can help us serve our clients better, those sorts of things. It's a larger discussion. So that was just something I thought I'd toss out if it was helpful for anyone.
Yeah, what I've seen is, and this is, just kind of based on some somewhat recent interviews that I've, conducting around the state and in other states, posing those questions to folks. And what we've seen is that it's, race is a hard conversation to have out in public in any workspace. And the same is true within nonprofit organizations. The sense that I've received is folks just aren't talking about it. No matter, how much we promote the idea of, is this something that you could add to your board agenda? Did we have any incidents? It's something that we moved to here recently at the school, is we're tracking how many incidences. That was, I think, one reason why I maybe highlighted. What are we running into that hasn't been reported in the past? Are we even talking about it? And so that's not to say that we're great by any means at tracking our diversity efforts. It's just to say that we knew we had to start somewhere. And that's one thing that we've started to track recently, is how many incidences, what were they, what was the outcome of them? And we found that as we do that consistently, one, it gets easier just by talking about it. And two, our constituents, our stakeholders really appreciate it.
Hey, Kenny, we had one question that was sort of related to that, which was, with so much polarization around racial equity, suggested approaches for engaging individuals who may be resistant. Thoughts about how to foster those conversations that you just say that we don't have. I know some of it is tracking data and having information to talk about, but I was wondering if you had other ideas.
Yeah, I think just opening it up and just asking, how people feel about it. This is, everything that I presented today was not to, push an agenda by any means. Again, we're in a university environment, but it's just simply, I think, the numbers. What do statistics say? I think we're all at least somewhat familiar with those. Go a long way to, as conversation starters. And so that was one reason why I shared the demographic numbers, and at least in terms of executives, all board members and board chairs, put that in front of people and see how they react to it. What does that mean to you? Good, bad, indifferent? And then I think if we can have honest conversations about how our own particular organizations are performing in relation to, is there something there? Again, just like we investigate what could we be doing along fundraising lines? What could we be doing to better promote ourselves from a communication standpoint? What positions do we need to invest in next? What partnerships do we have in communities? It seems like it's tough to lead that conversation now. But I think if we start with just statistics, those numbers that I put in front of folks aren't anything that Kenny generated. That's just research that's been tracked for, again, 30 years now, and seeing how folks react to it. And does that lead to a conversation? And it's not an agenda to say that organizations are bad that don't have more people of color in decision-making roles, but really should we? And I think the case, again, at least for me, I mean, choose whatever one you want, but the case for me is really, as we walk into, or as we, serve those that we do, and if we know as an organization that we serve a majority of clients that are people of color, it seems like it makes good business sense. And again, people have tried to make the business case. That's worked in some areas and some not so much, because we feel good about ourselves, generally speaking, with the work that we do.
Thanks. There's another question about some examples of accountability measures that can be put in place when people of color experience indirect, inadvertent, or unintentional equity in organizations. So what do leaders do when they see, you said, sort of tracking and understanding some of this, but also what do leaders do to maybe hold some folks accountable who are, I don't know, whether it's the bad apples or whether it's individuals who are inadvertent. These examples are inadvertent and indirect. So what can be done to when those come up?
Yeah, I might try to get our senior associate dean, Frank Ashley, Dr. Ashley, to chime in.
Hold out, Frank.
Yeah, but I think
riding
it's
the horses.
Yeah, our approach is to start with just having a conversation. Make sure that whoever the bad actor is knows that as the leader of the organization, I'm aware of this. We're going to document this, whether in a formal way or we're just going to have a conversation to start, and then make that part of the record. I mean, sometimes that's tough to do with bad performance on people being served. Dr. Ashley, anything maybe? Does that align with some of the stuff we do here?
Yeah, I guess one key thing that I'd throw out there, and we talk about this, I see Shekinah on the screen right here. One thing we talk, he's in my class. One of the things we talk about in class is when you talk about diversity, the two things that jump out are race and sex. And, a lot of people try to focus on those two items right there. But when you talk about diversity, I think it's easier to ease into a conversation when you talk about all the different areas of diversity. A perfect example, probably one of my greatest learning experiences here at the Bush School is when I had a student that was totally wheelchair bound. And I use this example in my class. I walked outside after class and he was, still at the door. And I said, so why aren't you, what are you still doing here? He goes, well, these doors aren't automatic and I can't get outside. I mean, there I was, someone who teaches diversity. I've been in this building for years, and I never realized that our building wasn't totally accessible to individuals with disabilities. That was a learning experience for me. And that's the frame of, that's the perspective that diverse groups bring to other individuals. If I never would have had him in my class, I never would have thought for 1 second that our building wasn't accessible. By bringing people in with different cultures, different religions, different thoughts, I mean, we just miss so many things because we see the world from our eyes, which is totally different than, you know, meeting with international students here. When they make statements like, you know, well, Dr. Ashley, I'm the last one to be chosen to be in a group because people think that, first of all, I can't speak the language well and I can't write well. You know, once again, if you're not in that situation, you just don't understand it. But it just, when we think about a diverse group, we're thinking about all those different areas that, I mean, Kenny, you know about this. I use the example of my grandmother making a quilt, taking a rag here and a rag there. But when everything's put together, you have this beautiful quilt. And that's really what diversity is. When you take people of different religions, different cultures, different sexes, different ages, different ability, when you put them all together, it makes this beautiful quilt right there. And that's really what diversity is. It's everyone taking everything that's a part of me and putting it together for the organization, for the whole group. And that's why and I don't know, a lot of times we want to focus on one specific thing, but it's a big conversation. It's a big conversation. And people have to be, I mean, and if you buy into this, people have to be held accountable for it. If this is what you believe, then you can't let this crazy uncle over here do whatever they want to do. No, we all have to buy into this, and we agree that this is what we want to do as an organization. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Absolutely. I know we've got a time to stick to. We certainly, I'm sure many of us at the school here, if anybody wants to hang on, and apologies for the snafu that we had there, but if there's other questions, definitely try to field those from you and add any perspective that we can.